We have a lot of people that are here that have came together for the community, and in healing our communities, we have our sacred fire present. We have our pipe carriers present. We have our pastors present from the native churches, and we have an opportunity to go ahead and to heal our communities by coming together. One of the things that we talk about with the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe is working together for our future. Even at these gatherings for Journey for Forgiveness and for this healing, honoring, and remembering our loved ones that have walked on from this boarding school, we come together not only as a tribe, different tribal nations, but also we come together as the city of Mount Pleasant, we come together in Isabella County, and certainly Central Michigan University. We couldn't have a better friend than Dr. Pamela Gates from Central Michigan University, who's been working countless hours on helping us with the advisory committee and being able to go ahead and to work on getting a couple dynamic speakers to go ahead and to share a message on boarding schools with you. And for the Zeebuwing Cultural Society, an avid supporter of that, and also the support that she's given through her research for the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe and Central Michigan University. I'd like to ask Dr. Pamela Gates to the podium to go ahead and to introduce our keynotes. Dr. Pam Gates.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My work and interaction with the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe began well over 20 years ago with my dear friend Bonnie Eckel. We were both working in Mary McGuire Elementary School at the time, and I think we made a difference, and I think we're still making a difference. Thank you, Bonnie, for all the work that you've done to help me. Dr. Mike DeGagne is the Executive Director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, a national organization dedicated to addressing the legacy of Canada's Indian residential school system. He has worked in the field of addiction and mental health for the past 30 years, first as a community worker on reserve in Northern Ontario, and later with the National Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Program. Mike serves on a number of boards of directors. He is past chairman of Ottawa's Queensway Carleton Hospital and is currently chairman of the Child Welfare League in Canada and the First Nations Advisory Council and Mental Health Commission. I'm also very proud to say that Mike is a graduate of Central Michigan University and of Michigan State University, that place down the road, and his PhD focuses on Aboriginal post-secondary education. Please join me and let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Mike DeGagne.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I appreciate the introduction and the kind invitation to come and speak today. I am a graduate of Central Michigan University, but I have to tell you this, I attended through at a time when Central was very busy in Canada and had a few little campuses up there in different towns. So I haven't been to Central Michigan University more than once. This is my second time. And so it was interesting to have that diploma on my wall for all these years, and it's been decades, to finally see it and drive around the campus. Most people actually see the campus before they graduate from it. I also was really pleased this morning to be invited to the ceremony, to the sunrise ceremony, and for the teachings that were offered. One observation I had was there was a moment in the ceremony when we were almost drowned out by some very noisy Canada geese coming in behind us. And I heard it. I don't know if you heard it. There's something interesting about Canada geese that I'm sure you all know, is that Canada geese travel in families. They're family units. Almost every goose in that little V is related. And the reason that they call to each other is they're telling each other that they're still there. So what they're actually saying is, I'm here. Now, if by the end of the day they don't hear a voice, they go back to where they slept the night before to find the one they left behind. And I thought that was so fitting that we were sitting there commemorating and honoring the people, the young children who attended residential schools and through their death had been left behind. It was for me, as a Canadian, very, very fitting. We share a common history, and I know you know the history of the boarding schools, the residential schools, but in Canada the phenomenon was very much the same. 100 years of forced institutionalization, many children pursued in their communities by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who were charged with forcibly removing children and bringing them to residential schools, often long distances from their home. It's not unusual, talking to my colleague from Canada this morning, to have grown up in northern Quebec and have to go to a residential school many thousands of kilometers away in Sault Ste. Marie. And that was an experience many residential school students shared. But I want to talk to you a little bit about a healing movement, huge healing movement that's happening in Canada amongst Native people, and how it can be continued here, how much inspiration we've drawn from you, and we hope we've been an inspiration to you as well. And I just wanted to tell you a few of the teachings and learnings that I've encountered in that time. I belong to an organization called the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and we are part of a healing movement in Canada. And it started with, as all of these things tend to do, with voices in the wilderness. Voices of people who go to meetings and say, you know, we should talk about the residential schools. And people say, you know what, one of these days we should get around to doing that. And I think of my friend Charlene, who grew up in a residential school on the west coast of Canada, and she used to go to Chiefs meetings and said, she'd always stand up and say, you know, I know these problems are here. I know we have these problems: health, housing, education. But you know, maybe we should start to talk about the residential schools. Maybe that's at the heart of it. Maybe all of the thousands of us who went to these institutions have something to say about why we are the way we are today. And the Chiefs would say, that's a good idea. We should do that one day. So first, you have to start with the voices in the wilderness, the people who are persistently speaking to you about a problem like residential school. And then the second thing is that you need a few courageous voices. And we were lucky to have a few courageous voices, and I don't know your experience, there may be those courageous voices here amongst you today. But what happened to us was that in a ballroom in a hotel on the west coast of Canada in the early 1990s, our national chief was speaking at a conference, and he stood up and he talked about, wow, we've got to start to talk about residential schools and that residential school experience. And he said, you know, further, we have to talk about abuse there. And I want to say, he said, that I was abused sexually in residential schools. It was a public admission, his first public admission, and something that started our movement. If the national chief can speak of these things, then we all need to speak of these things. And Phil Fontaine was one of our first courageous voices to speak about residential schools and abuses there. Later, I should give credit to a woman who was the minister, the senior official, the politician who led the Department of Indian Affairs in Canada in the early 1990s, the late 1990s. Her name was Jane Stewart. And Jane received a report about conditions amongst Aboriginal peoples, and they asked her, what do you think we should do? How should we respond to this report? We had so many reports about the lives of Aboriginal people. She says, you know, the first thing we should do is we should have a movement to reconcile. We should have a statement of reconciliation, and I should apologize for residential schools. Of course, she was counseled not to. By admitting the government's role in residential schools, the crime, as Dennis Banks told us this morning, by admitting that, we open the floodgates for all kinds of problems. But you need a courageous voice. Jane Stewart stood up 1998, early January, and made a statement of reconciliation on national television. And in that statement, she said, for those of you who attended Indian residential schools and were abused there and have lived all these years thinking this was somehow your fault, We want you to know that this is not your fault and it should never have happened. And on behalf of the Government of Canada, I wish to say we are deeply sorry. And that started a movement for us. That kept it going. And she said, further, I'm going to create an Aboriginal Healing Foundation to help support financially all of these organizations and all of these small healing gatherings that are occurring across the country to keep our movement going. And she created the organization that I work with. For us, it was a substantial move forward. It was quite significant. Over time, we received several infusions of funding, and we were able to fund 1,500 projects across the country with $500 million in support. We were money managers, we were funders, but most of all, we were supporters of the healing movement. That's what we do. So what else did we learn? Well, one of the first things we learned was that we have to heal ourselves. We have to start with ourselves. And I know my board of directors, people who directed our organization, would support my saying this, but we had our own problems first. And those of you who have worked in the Native community on committees, councils, know you often have to deal with your own problems first, and we did. And we fought with each other. And we wanted to make sure we all came to that table making sure that our people got their share. That's where we started out. It was a disaster. So we were at a meeting in late '98, and we were fighting. And one of the elders that was at the meeting, she stood up, she said, look at how we have been taught to talk to each other. Look at how we relate to each other. We're not together anymore. So she says, I want to stop this meeting and I want to go through an exercise. She says, there's 17 of us here. I want each of you, in turn, to tell all of us how you got here, who you are, who is your family, who you are as a person. And she said, if we deal with each other as people, not as organizations or as entities or as jurisdictions, we'll be farther ahead. And we started that exercise. It lasted 3 or 4 hours. And in the last 12 years, we've started every meeting in the same way. Who have you become since we last met? What has been your journey? Who should we think about when we think about you? We've shared about our families and our hopes and our dreams, and now we deal with each other as people. And I can easily say that as a group, that has helped us distribute this money in a way that everyone appreciates in a fair and just and equitable way. And it's had a lot of power for us. So we healed ourselves first. The second thing we did was that we returned the voice to the people we served. The survivors of residential schools, the former students of Indian boarding schools. You know, when we started out, we said to people, here's what we're going to do. You send us a little application that says what you think healing is in your community and how you'd like to address it. And then we'll fund you. So people would call us and say, all right, what would you like us to say? How would you like us to fill out this form? What do you think is the best healing? We say, look, we're not asking you to guess what we want. We don't have anything behind our cards here. You tell us what you want. But you know what? We lost the ability to do that. We lost the ability as communities to trust ourselves and to say, this is what's good for us. If you can believe it. People came to us and said, look, we'd like to use traditional elders in our practice, healing practices. Do you have a list of approved elders that you'd like us to use? I'm not kidding. Can you imagine going to a community and saying, no, I don't think that's a legitimate elder, you'll have to use this person over here. But this is what some communities were asking of us. This is what had become of us. We didn't trust ourselves enough to seek out the help of our own elders or identify what was healing for ourselves. But over the last 12 years, I've seen that voice grow and grow and grow. And now we're the people who heal ourselves. We're in charge. And the movement has grown stronger and stronger. Another way that we decided that we would return the voice to our own people was we had 36 consultations across the country where we would have a gathering like this We would go to some large cities, some small communities, and say, look, we're with the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. We deal with residential schools. Why don't you come and sit with us? We'll feed you lunch, and you tell us what you want us to do. You tell us what you think. And we started with little groups of 10 in the far north, and then later on there were 400 and 500 people that would gather in friendship centers in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. I can tell you, this is an exercise not for the faint of heart. This was a brutal exercise for those of us who work at the foundation. There was so much anger. All of these things about residential schools came spilling out. All of those experiences, all directed at us. Who are you to help us heal? And we had to let that anger out. We had to help it emerge from people. And then as we did this over the 10 years, we could see the tone of this discussion changing, where people began to trust each other and work together. But I think that's one of the things that we learned more than anything. You have to let the voices of the people return. People in those 36 regional national gatherings talked about loss. They talked about all kinds of losses, the loss of innocence, the loss of family. The number one loss that they talked about, and I've heard it mentioned here today a number of times, I imagine it doesn't surprise many of you, but the number one loss that was discussed in every one of those gatherings was the loss of language. It's the loss of language. That's who you are. That's how you express yourself. That's where your ideas come from. And I thought, isn't that interesting that people wanted that language back so badly and had lost both the ability to express themselves and to be able to conceptualize what it was that amounted to their own healing. We had a tough road in a couple of places. One of the hardest things that we had to deal with was we had to communicate to our own people, and we had to communicate to the rest of the Canadian population one simple idea: the past matters. What happened a decade ago, or 2 decades ago, or 3 decades ago to people matters. You know, that was absolutely. How many times have you heard, and I can tell you how many times we've heard the idea that, look, what is with you people? That happened decades ago. Why don't you just get beyond the residential schools and beyond the abuse and what happened, and we can move forward in a positive way and begin to fix what's wrong. And so we had to deal with a lot of Canadians who felt like by dredging up the past, we were leaving ourselves in the past, and we weren't going forward in a hopeful way to a brighter future. So we had to explain, look, if you can't acknowledge and learn and gain lessons from your past and what happened to Aboriginal people in the past, we're never going to move forward. We're never going to get better. We also had to do this exercise with our own people. Many people who went to residential schools had a positive experience. There's many gatherings I go to that's difficult to say. People say, look, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I got a great education. Anyone in my community that's done anything really positive and wonderful went to residential school. They are our leaders. We get Christmas cards from former teachers at residential school that say, look, you know, I really feel offended. I love the children. I help them. They still write to me. I worked in a residential school and I gave my heart and soul to it. Fair enough. We acknowledge those positive things. But we have to acknowledge and get people to understand that all of those things happened in a system that was deeply, deeply harmful to our people. You can do good things in a bad system. At its core, this was a crime. And the people who participated in this crime often did so with a good heart. But it's still a crime. We move on now to reconciliation. We have to, as one person said, as many of you know, we started a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, an opportunity for survivors of residential schools to get together to tell their truth, to get the story told about residential schools. And one commentator in the newspaper that I read said, you know what? Let them have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They will talk to each other, and when they're done, they'll feel better, and we'll all move on. And you know, I think our national chief said it best. He said, you know what? This is not a commission for Aboriginal people. This is an Aboriginal commission for all Canadians. We have to reach across the aisle and get beyond speaking to ourselves and speak to all of Canada and say this is important to all of us. We've gone through truth-telling exercises. And at the Healing Foundation, one of the exercises that we've begun is that we have on videotape or on audio tape, we have the stories of 800 survivors of residential school who have sat down, told us their story about what happened to them, and then we've captured that for future generations on digital tape so that researchers, for example, can use them. And you know, the survivors signed away and were allowing us to view those in respect, show them in a respectful way to the public and show them in a respectful way to academics who wish to study the residential school movement. So I think that has been a very positive thing for us. But we have to guard against too much focus on truth-telling and not enough focus on action. I was speaking at a conference with this young researcher from Duke University. And he said, does anybody here know how many feet of books have captured the testimony and the truth of Aboriginal people in the Canadian archives? He says, I know because I worked there last summer. So we guessed, and he said, the answer is 125 feet of printed testimony. And then he posed the question, how many more feet do we need before people will understand us? And it's a very good point, because I think we need truth and the telling of truth and capturing our testimony for each other and for ourselves, so we know that in our stories we're not alone. But what we need to do is change those stories into something meaningful for the rest of the American population and the rest of the Canadian population, so that people know this is what happened, and then we take action, healing, and reconciliation. We need to learn from our past. I'll tell you a little story, just in closing. I have two friends who are moose hunters, and they're good moose hunters. So many years ago, of course, the challenge is all gone for them, moose hunting in their area. So they said, you know what, we should do something a little different. Why don't we charter a helicopter and we'll fly into the woods, and then all by ourselves out in the wilderness, nothing around, we can do a little moose hunting, and then the helicopter comes back and picks us up. Fantastic idea. So they did this for many years. One year they, like so many others, they took the helicopter out in the woods. The pilot dropped them off. 2 days later the pilot returned, and both men are standing there in the clearing with two large moose. So the pilot said, geez, you know, this looks like you guys did very, very well this year. He says, but they're awfully large. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll take one of the moose. I think that's all I have room for. And the two hunters said, look, last year we had two moose, and the pilot didn't give us a hard time about it. So the pilot said, oh, okay, well, in that case, yeah, I'll take them both. So they loaded the two moose up, and the hunters jumped in, and away they went. But sure enough, it was way too heavy. And it wasn't long, they weren't more than a mile away, and then the helicopter started to go down and crashed in the woods. So both the hunters crawl out, and they're dazed, confused, and one hunter says, my God, where do you think we are? And the other one said, I think we're pretty close to where we crashed last year. So it's my hope that as much as we crash, we learn from every one of those things, and we start a healing movement, and we continue to move forward based on the thing that was central to all of our healing in Canada, that is that the past matters. And events like this are historic. There's courageous voices right here. There's people among you that have come in from the wilderness, voices in the wilderness all these years, and finally you're among friends here talking about the boarding schools. and it's important. And one day we'll look back on this day and know that this was a seminal event in your own healing movement. Thank you very much.